Drusus winter posts along the Weser and further into Magna Germania operated under these pressures. His engineers estimated timber supply, while his commanders carefully rationed coin, that strange alloy of Rome's bleeding treasury and battlefield spoils, since too much money in camp often meant a rise in both gambling and desertion. Logistical plans were drawn with vigilance. A marching column might carry dice carved from deer bone alongside rations of hardtack and salt pork. As forts like Alaiso took shape, their commanders had to build not only walls but regulations, frayed rules of camp economy, trying to simulate the order of the res publica at the edge of the known world. What commanders learned too often too late was that a Roman soldier at leisure could be as dangerous as a barbarian at arms. Where gambling grew unchecked, so did violence, corruption, and envy. A lucky soldier at dice might claim more authority than his centurion, and a drunken veteran on a losing streak might turn his blade not on Sugambri raiders, but on his own bunkmate. In cold regions especially, where firelight replaced sun and leisure replaced campaign, these were dangers no engineering could fortify against. As campaigns stretched deeper into the northern forests and discipline bent under the long strain of frontier, garrisoning the boundaries between game and grievance blurred. Within the flickering light of torches and the clatter of knuckle bones, loyalties were tested, and soon in more than just games fortunes would be lost. Northern winter sank early over the Rhine. In icy camps from Vetera to Mogontiacum, the daily pace of military drill slackened after dusk, replaced by a more erratic rhythm. Barked laughter muffled shouts, the slow shifting of hearth smoke above tented leather. Behind the palisades and the shadowed spaces between decurions, tents and latrine ditches, order dissolved into ritualized comfort, the sharing of diluted wine wagering over dice, and talk darkened by the day's dead. Officially, each contubernium received a measured share of vinum, rationed by the optio in charge of camp provisioning. This wine, transported in heavy amphorae, often cut with cold river water, barely resembled the Falernian of senatorial villas. It was pragmatic, barely palatable, but crucially predictable. Yet predictability thinned in the outposts. On cold fronts such as Germania Inferior, where patrols stretched for hours in the sleet and morale withered under the weight of boredom, and fear the unspoken rules of the camp softened. Wine rationing, never formalized in military statute, depended instead on tacit consent and personal discretion. An optio might enforce strict limits in summer, but come winter that same officer could look away, as a centuria scavenged extra jars mislaid from the supply train. Peer pressure functioned more powerfully than discipline to abstain, was to invite ridicule to cheat, was to be envied. Moreover, not all wine passed through official hands. Indigenous merchants, Nervii muleteers, Trevuri colonists, even suspiciously friendly Batavian scouts, hovered near the outer ramparts. They traded not only cured meats and bronze trinkets, but darker wines and unfamiliar liquors. Some brought infusions of honey or herbs stripped from the Gallic forests. Others sold distillates of unknown strength drawn from clay pots fitted with wax seals. These contraband vessels bypassed the ration line, fetched inflated prices, and ignored dilution. The effects were immediate and destabilizing. Intoxication blurred ranks and loosened tongues hardened by campaign silence. Disputes broke out over imagined slights, over dice cheats, over women glimpsed near the market fence. What happened inside the Principia remained controlled. Outside it, discipline thinned. After one such night, centurions discovered a legionary from Legio XXI Rapax splayed behind the field latrines, with his ears cut, the mark of Sparta scratched into his shoulder. No enemy had crossed the limes that night. No alarm rang. It had been, as the legate later reported, an accident among comrades. The state, of course, sought to regulate. Thinking Roman commanders traced such declines to lapses in regimen. New codes issued under Augustus had warned against luxuria and demanded sobriety, especially among younger soldiers. Restraint could be ordered, but enforcement fractured under cold distance and exhaustion. Even learned officers who admired stoic tenets sometimes admitted in writing or silence that morale mattered more than habit. In tight-knit units marooned in forests or perched along the Euphrates, collective trust bound men together more than any formal law. True violation was not the drinking itself, but being the cause of a lapse in vigilance. Still, risk compounded. The presence of alcohol amplified fault lines. Long-standing rivalries among cohorts or animosities between Roman-born legionaries and provincial auxiliaries often found their tipping point in a shared cup. More than once, gladius wounds were discovered in wine-drenched cloaks, their origins cloaked by silence or lies. The commander might dismiss it as nocturnal foolishness, the legate might call for an investigation that never closed. But under the habit of postponed discipline lay the truth: unregulated drink dulled the edge of Rome's sword. And yet withdrawal was impossible. Wine was too ingrained, too sacred and profane at once. It salved the frostbite of Illyricum and fogged the trauma of crushed bones at the Danubian crossings. Legionaries wound down each night with stories of home spun in Latin, Greek, or broken Gaulish over warmed wine pots. It was not simply consumption, but communion. The same diluted red liquid used in civic libations, now stewed in crude iron pans. And here Rome's universality sustained itself, wine binding men to a fading sense of order, even as its overuse quietly undermined the very discipline Rome claimed to teach. Across the Rhine, in isolated watchtowers and palisades half swallowed by mud, the boundaries would continue to blur. The next caravan of traders might bring new brews, stronger, cheaper, unregulated. A fatigued Optio might again wave his authority to keep the peace. One more evening might pass without a brawl, then another. But eventually the wine would be stronger than the will to hold the line. And the night would open not with trumpet but with a shout, and the blurred glint of a blade drawn not from fear of barbarians, but from familiarity with what Roman steel had become when soberness ceased to guide the hand. Beyond the palisade, where the disciplined rows of the Roman castra yielded to mud paths and open earth, a different rhythm overtook the soldier's day. In the narrowed silence after combat, when buckles were loosened and javelins cleaned, men drifted toward the edge of order. Just beyond the Porta di Cumana, past the last sentry post, an illicit market thickened with every passing week of campaign. It was not officially on any map nor granted sanction by Rome's laws, but it had names passed from cohort to cohort: the subcastrum, the vulgus, or less tactfully the caenum, the filth. Here in Gaul, Germania, Pannonia, Judea, Roman arms brought security, and then inevitably appetite. Comedic troops flashing borrowed togas performed mock trials and bawdy scenes from Plautus for a few quadrants. Lupinaria, makeshift brothels stitched from canvas and ambition, did brisk trade by the hour. Meat stalls roasted sparrows or stringy dog on spits over trench braziers, charging inflated prices to men flush with battlefield plunder. At dusk, loud cries for dice games, gladiatorial duels, or traveling bards swallowed the sound of hammer on shield in the camp. Such indulgence filled a gap that Rome's war machine, efficient at conquest, slow at compassion, could never quite bridge. Official rations, barley, grain, and a flicker of salt offered survival but not comfort. Commanders, even when Rome issued direct regulation, often yielded to the pressure of morale. Few legati legionis barred the gatherings, especially in long campaigns where boredom bred mutiny faster than cold. Instead, they tolerated a porous boundary between the castra and its murky shadow on the theory that contained vice was preferable to unmonitored sedition. But commerce, once admitted, was not easily civilized. Beyond the flickering torches of perfumed actors and hucksters, more sinister players moved among the stalls. The profiteers, speculators with no military rank, sold overpriced wine surgically thinned with water and chalk. They trafficked in dyed cloaks, iron trinkets, false coin, and expired food. Worse still were the pimps who shadowed the traveling women, some indentured, some enslaved, some simply desperate, and bribed options or bribed guards to secure access. By the second year of Tiberius's campaigns across the Rhine, such figures had become more familiar than the names of enemy chieftains. Under lax supervision, these unofficial economies metastasized. Command posts might turn a blind eye, but disorder was never far behind. Scuffles between bronze-wealthy centurions and cheated veterans escalated beyond disciplined drills. A stolen purse or broken contract became cause for knives. Crates of looted goods cloaked in darkness changed hands nightly at the margins of military authority. In northern Hispania, one governor noted that legionaries were sending more ore home from subcastral winnings than from donatives or salary alone. Many of them acquired through games of Alea, so rigged they functioned more as extortion than chance. Morale paradoxically declined the more these indulgences grew. As men grew accustomed to the distractions of the sideline markets, absenteeism spread. Fewer soldiers attended morning drills. Sentinel ranks thinned during night watches. Some units, especially those detached from the core armies for fort garrison or frontier patrol, reported entire centuries, abandoning their posts to follow favored entertainers along festival routes or regional fairs. Others found soldiers impersonating civilians to bypass curfew along the Via Militaris. In Germania Superior, Flavian commanders struggled to untangle legions from the web of vice that had grown around Mogontiacum. One legatus attempted to reconstruct Roman dignity by banning all civilian encampments within a mille passuum of fortress walls, only to provoke mass desertion among auxiliaries and suicides among the encampment-bound women. That decurion resigned. His replacement reinstated the lupinaria within a month. This permissiveness bore longer shadows. Religious cults popular among entertainers and camp followers began to find converts within the ranks, straddling the line between personal piety and ideological drift. Veterans returning to Rome from 6-year foreign postings brought with them not just scars and coin, but new rites, unfamiliar gods, and allegiance to leaders known more for feasts and favors than for any service to the res publica. For every shield-borne triumph, a quieter moral erosion advanced beneath the banners. It was not always ruinous, but it was cumulative. Order in the Roman military frame depended less on force than on contained expectation. When entertainment outgrew hierarchy and commerce outran discipline, that containment estranged from its source. A century might still march in line, still call out in Latin formation commands, but its inner coherence had shifted elsewhere, drawn toward the flicker of torchlight beyond the palisade. And as fresh recruits arrived from Italy or Illyricum, young, half-trained, unblooded, they entered not a camp of stoic veterans but a world of spectacle, temptation, and slow corrosion of purpose. The javelin remained sharp, the oath was still spoken, but behind it a troop of shadows moved. Stiltwalkers, gamblers, traffickers, and cynical old hands who no longer believed in triumph, only in the next throw of the dice. Order still held, but beyond the gates it trembled. The snows had begun to drift around the northern watchtowers when Saturnalia came to the castra near Mogontiacum, modern Mainz, on the cold banks of the Rhine. The fortified camp, garrisoned by Roman legionaries and Batavian auxiliaries, had frozen into a tense stillness broken only by ritual. Saturnalia, ancient festival of inversion, when masters served slaves and soldiers gambled openly, arrived not as sanctioned merriment, but as ignition. In peacetime, winter's life behind the palisades of a frontier legion was a suspended vigilance. The legions drilled less, patrolled less, and grew quietly more restless. Saturnalia offered release. Overseen for centuries by the state and provinces, it became a murkier affair. Freed from Rome's urban moderation, it drifted into lawless parody. Soldiers, often unpaid for months, were allowed a brief season of mockery, of disorder, repackaged as custom. Uniforms were swapped for tunics, officers donned cloaks of slaves, tribunes feigned servitude. But beneath the roleplay swelled older frustrations. The legionaries, mostly veterans of campaigns east and west, had gone too many months without donatives. Local traders had replaced official paymasters. Wine and salt were bought on credit. Gambling became both a pastime and a scab to pick, a nightly rearrangement of fortunes equally lost to chance and cheated dice. Tabula boards littered the barracks, knucklebones clicked across hastily flattened shields. Batavian scouts trusted auxilia from the Rhine Delta, shared this licentious mood, though not always the Roman rules. What had once been tolerated performances of equality collided with ethnic tension and martial pride. The Batavi were no auxiliaries in name only. Their cavalry had secured victories under Germanicus, and Claudius Tacitus would later extol them as both swift and fierce. But their loyalty was strained, rewarded with partial rights, rarely with land, and always dependency. To the Roman legionaries, they were both brothers in arms and barbarians in too close proximity. On the third night of Saturnalia, feasting spilled beyond curfew. Stronger drink than the diluted Pascha ration reached the men, likely traded from Germanic settlers, fermented from rye or honeyed fruit. Bonfires burned hot. Songs first in Latin turned to the Batavian tongue, and by the sixth amphora demands turned to insults. A gaming dispute, perhaps over a jug, perhaps over a woman, quickly unraveled. A Batavian threw the first punch. A legionary drew a dagger. What began as a brawl erupted into a battalia fought not by maniples, but by drunken fists and rank grudges. Stop lines frayed, centuries dissolved into chaos. The acting tribunus, a mid-level commander appointed after higher-ranking officers were recalled to Rome, responded too late. By dawn, 3 men lay dead, 2 Roman legionaries and a Batavian scout. The latter's death triggered a tribal alarm. The Batavian contubernia refused the morning muster, demanding redress and formal inquiry, as if in a court of law. News filtered back to the Rhinebank settlements, where Batavian traders, who maintained kinship and oath networks with the auxiliaries, threatened to pull goods and supplies. Strategically, the timing could not have been worse. The procurator's courier from Gallia Belgica had already confirmed that Annona shipments, grain allocations managed from Lugdunum, were delayed by flooding. The Rhine forts were operating on truncated supply chains reliant on local collections and forced requisition. Disaffection could not be allowed to metastasize into revolt, for the tribunus options narrowed with each hour. Roman law did not convict legions as collectives, yet neither could he afford tribal revenge. A compromise was crafted, not in the forum but by diplomacy at the watchtower gate. The 3 most belligerent legionaries, already bruised and mutinous, were surrendered for trial by flagram, the lash. In turn, the Batavian century rejoined parade formation, though the cold salutes and stiff bearing betrayed the crack. Saturnalia ended not in laughter but in locked arms. This outbreak, while contained, would echo. The Batavian leadership sent formal protest to the legate of Upper Germania. Reports filtered into administrative roles in Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensis, resulting in the quiet reassignment of several options and the forced early retirement of the tribunus. But the damage was not merely administrative. Saturnalia had revealed how visible the seam had become, between citizen legionary and provincial auxiliary, between sanctioned Roman right and dangerous freedom. As snowmelt trickled down into the Rhine, commanders up and down the river frontier met in private, examining their roles, tightening wine controls, ordering surplus dice confiscated. Patrol rotations were increased and forced marches reinstated, even in frost, for the sake of discipline. Old traditions, once maintained to bind the legionary identity, now posed new risks. When Lucius Vocula took command of a sector that same winter, he did so not with a gesture of trust, but under heavy guard. The Saturnalia riot at Mogontiacum did not cause the Batavian revolt, but it foreshadowed it. Within less than a generation, those auxiliaries would rise not with daggers and dice-fueled rage, but with cavalry and oath brothers against Rome herself. And the laughter of the winter festival would return no more. In the winter of a fractured Roman world, the camp at Ticinum, Modern-day Pavia along the cold banks of the Padus became something more volatile than an outpost. It was December of 68 CE and Nero was dead by his own hand. Rome drifted rudderless. Galba, austere and aging, held power in name, but not in the affections of his army. Among the troops stationed in Cisalpine Gaul, hunger simmered beneath near-frozen ground. The donativa promised by Galba, inherited obligations from the late emperor's extravagance, remained unpaid. Grain was delivered late or in half measure, and the soldiers, winter rations of pannies and thin pools became as bitter as the idle silence filling the tents. Retreating from the rigid cadence of the march, soldiers now clustered around campfires under makeshift shelters of leather and wood. The formal structures of duty collapsed in the in-between spaces of war and waiting. Dice clattered on shield backs, tabula boards slid across sand-strewn floors, drafts of watered wine passed from hand to calloused hand. The gambling began first as distraction: a few bronze coins, a portion of salted pork, even a pair of sandals wagered among laughing tent mates. But as hunger deepened and pay remained elusive, risk itself became a form of sustenance. Some men lost everything but their arms, others, suddenly rich in spoils and bets, amassed drinking companions instead of respect. Rivals were made in tents, not on the battlefield. The camp's edge, once patrolled with disciplined routine, became blurred by civilian intrusion. Traders from across the Po Valley crept close, bringing honeyed wine, olives, brittle cakes, and, less visibly, gamble-ready prostitutes, street performers, and speculators who offered loans at ruinous terms. A black economy grew in the mud outside the gates, a camp-following market with the vices of Rome, but without its magistrates. In theory, the options and centurions held order over this outer realm. In practice, most turned a blind eye or partook themselves. Galba had issued new dictates against waste feasting and unauthorized furloughs, his vision of military rectitude. But enforcement waned the farther his decree traveled from Rome. Worsening matters, the legions had been recruited not only from traditional Italian heartlands, but also from provincial cities, auxiliary ranks, and hastily levied Gauls. These men brought different tongues, customs, and expectations regarding the bonds of military life. In the absence of formal reward, shared revelry replaced discipline. Control, never strong to begin with in the liminal winter months, unraveled quickly. Saturnalia, typically circumscribed even in outposts, detonated into prolonged lawlessness. Drinking parodies of command replaced actual parade, inverted orders shouted in jest blurred into real defiance in the mornings after. It was in this cauldron of discontent that Aulus Vitellius, commander of the armies in Germania, inferior, saw opportunity. Hearing of Galba's failure to secure the loyalty of his troops, Vitellius moved south, knowing that morale at Ticinum was fragile and hopes of payment long abandoned. Where Galba had withheld, Vitellius promised. News spread through the ranks: Vitellius will pay what Galba denied. With no Senate decree behind him, no formal acclamation beyond the frontier, Vitellius relied on something older than law: the immediate exchange of coin for loyalty. Soldiers who had gambled their pay now demanded their due in full. Their fury turned toward those who stood in the way. The mutiny began with shouted appeals and mock tribunes doused in spilled wine. Discipline collapsed further when legates loyal to Galba attempted to quell the outcry through appeals to law. They were pelted with bits of bread and bone. Within days, order was ceded entirely. The soldiers swore for Vitellius not in rank formation but in a disorderly gathering, more mob than cohort. Centurions who resisted were struck down. The camp's gates, normally shut at dusk, swung open for entertainers, sellers, and hangers-on, now indistinguishable from the soldiers themselves. Vitellius's emissaries arrived with food served hot in the style of gladiator rations, lavish and symbolic. It was not just nourishment, it was theater. The gesture exploited every grievance against Galba's austerity. Slaves and locals wandered unchecked through the camp during the distribution, some mocking soldiers with peeled belts and purloined purses. The behavior, far from punished, was ignored or tacitly endorsed. The lines between discipline and indulgence had blurred beyond recovery. Rome's professional armies, once drilled by Marius and hardened on the rivers of the East, now marked allegiance by appetite. But unity forged in feasting brought strange consequences. Not long after, at the 7th milestone from Rome, a terrible slaughter broke out. Legionaries, unable to restrain themselves from violence against civilians and auxiliaries alike. The loose camp culture, once dismissed as temporary morale, had taken root as something enduring, uncontrolled, and ripe for further revolt. As Vitellius advanced on Rome, borne by the fervor of soldiers no longer restrained by hierarchy, he inherited more than support. He inherited a force increasingly swayed not by strategy or res publica, but by the rhythms of wine, wager, and spectacle. The cost of buying loyalty had not been tabulated yet, but debt, political, moral, and practical, was accumulating, and soon it would come due. By the late 2nd century CE, the Roman frontier camps stretched like a fractured chain across the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates. Behind timber palisades and stone ramparts, the legions watched the endless forests and dry passes, shifting endlessly between restraint and reprisal. But it was not always the enemy at the gates that unsettled these soldiers. It was the uncertainty within. Weeks between patrols, months without battle, years serving under neglectful governors, these pauses hollowed out the rhythm of campaign life. And into that silence crept new gods. Roman public religion had always been civic. Sacrifices proclaimed by magistrates, auguries, attended for Senate auspices, festivals organized by priestly colleges from within the urbs Roma. But in the peripheries, where temples stood half-finished and state rituals offered poor consolation for frostbite or desert malarial fevers, many soldiers sought meaning elsewhere. From Pannonia to Moesia, from Mauritania to Syria, foreign cults, once scoffed at in the Forum, began to flourish in the shadows of the Castra. Foremost among these was the cult of Mithras. Born not from the state, but from mystery, it promised salvation through ritual, ordeal, secret fraternity, and cosmic victory against the darkness. The scene was always the same: the Tauroctony Mithras slaying a bull in a cavern flanked by torchbearers. Yet beyond the iconography lay a structure that mirrored legionary order: grades, initiation rites, oaths. At Dura Europos on the Euphrates, beneath layers of military detritus, archaeologists would later unearth a Mithraeum within the camp itself. Painted stars adorned the ceiling, benches lined the walls, a temple built not for spectacle but immersion. Officers, scribes, and centurions gathered here by lamplight, whispering vows, far removed from Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, or the Capitoline Triad. Alongside Mithras, older gods re-emerged in stranger forms. Isis, whose cult had traveled from the Nile Delta to Campania centuries earlier, now permeated the periphery. Her mysteries, rich in spectacle and steeped in resurrection mythology, drew in those wounded by loss or liminality. In forts like Vindolanda in Britannia or Sétif in Numidia, altars named her, rituals honored her, and votive offerings suggested syncretism at work. Roman soldiers invoking the Egyptian goddess in Latin prose. Local gods, too, whose names went unrecorded in the capital, found new adherents among Rome's military class. Jupiter Dolichanes, once a Syrian sky warrior now dressed with Roman attributes, was favored by cavalry officers. His imagery fused the East and the Empire, an astral deity bearing thunderbolt and double axe, worshipped in military towns from the Danube Bend to Britannia's North Wall. To a legionary far from home, these cults offered what state religion could not: intimacy, community, a personal pact with the divine. The Senate had little reach into these margins. The state tolerated foreign cults unless they subverted loyalty to the emperor or disrupted public order. But these new beliefs blurred the lines. Soldiers sworn by Mithras revered Sol Invictus above the civic gods. Drilled into oaths far deeper than the Sacramentum Militaris, They formed tight circles, sharing initiation secrets never recorded in public fasti, nor sworn before any Roman magistrate. In time, even commanders adopted these rites, carrying them from Africa to Rhaetia, not just tolerating but transmitting them through the imperial machine. Cohesion shifted. Legionary camaraderie, once forged by standardized drill public rites and the ever-present threat of battle, increasingly drew sustenance from these private gatherings. When grain spoilt under thin supply lines, when promotions stalled in corrupt chains of command, it was the inner ritual, the promise of rebirth or divine protection, that sustained morale. These cults, intentionally arcane and fiercely intimate, gave the neglected soldier status within alternative hierarchies. This evolution sharpened attention within Roman institutional religion. The pontifices in Rome, the flamens and haruspices, crafted petitions on behalf of the res publica. For good harvests, victorious campaigns, civil harmony. But in the cold barracks of a Rhine winter, such abstract blessings rang hollow. Instead, men scrubbed blood into altars in underground chambers, whispered to gods by flickering flame, sought solace not in the Senate's triumphs, but in ritual silence. The spread was not without cost. In the temples of Mithras, secrecy was rule. Initiates were bound by oaths. Such embedded loyalty risked overriding official command structures. When officers faltered, men looked not to their tribunus or legatus, but to their mystic brotherhood. And while many emperors tolerated this spiritual autonomy, others, like Diocletian, saw in it a veiled challenge to central authority. Seeking to restore order, they persecuted Christian sects first, then eyed all mystery cults with suspicion. Yet by then, the process had grown too complex to reverse. Roman religion had become plural and fragmented, no longer bound to the forum, but carried in the minds of men across thousands of miles. As the empire aged and its borders grew brittle, religion itself became mobile. Mithraic cells traveled with postings linking Lambesis to Carnuntum and Cologne to Syria. Officers became missionaries. Soldiers served not only under eagles, but under stars, reborn in darkness, loyal to Rome, but now through other channels. But beneath this spiritual mosaic, another pattern emerged, one of fragmentation. If Rome's strength once lay in shared civic rights and public oaths, what happens when its defenders turn inward? When their sacra become hidden, their gods foreign, and their fellowship secret? Rome had yet to reckon with how many gods now wore its helmet. By the late 1st century CE, the legions stationed in Syria had become fixtures of the eastern frontier. Less a garrison, more a class of easternized soldier settlers. At Antioch, at Zeugma on the Euphrates, and in the supply corridors that snaked through Syria, toward Palmyra, Roman legions lingered not for weeks but for generations. These were not the rapid strike armies of Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, or the lean columns that once punished Numidian resistance under Scipio. Here the eastern limes offered a different kind of war, slow attrition, watch-post tedium, and long intervals of peace, punctuated by minor raiding or diplomatic friction with Parthian satraps. Soldiers spent more time manning towers than throwing pila, and as the years stretched, so too did the reach of local seductions. In Antioch, a Roman metropolis in all but republican virtue, Latin and Greek mingled on the street. Philosophy competed with spectacle, and Syrian merchants bartered silks and spices beneath archways older than Augustus's marriage laws. Here legionaries, once trained to endure marches across wet Britannia soil, picked up subtler rhythms, the cadences of Euripidean tragedies in open-air theaters, the measured odds of gaming dens in the shadow of the colonnades, and the slow interior collapse brought by sundown wine, cheap perfume, and relentless leisure. Many of the soldiers stationed at Legio IV Scythica, or III Gallica, no longer remembered the highland rigors of Pannonia, or the harsh flanking exercises of Scribonian drill orders. Enlistment forms were still Roman, but the behaviors had long gone native. The problem was not idleness alone. Embedded in the local economy, soldiers, married indigenous women, ran informal taverns through intermediaries, and even cultivated small properties in surrounding lands with tacit permission from commanding officers. Pay cycles blurred with civilian debts. The annona, Rome's central grain supply, was often delayed or diverted, offset by local contracts that tied legionaries not to the treasury but to local traders. Over time, these ties hardened into obligations. Governors in Syria found it increasingly difficult to extract men from their posts when campaigns flared elsewhere. A campaign into Armenia, or a sudden coalitional threat to Arabia Petrea, might technically fall within the legion's remit. But detachments now demanded bribes, delayed their mobilization with plague rumors, or submitted appeals citing civilian dependency. It came to a head during Vespasian's Judean campaign in 67 CE. Recalled from Caesarea, recently tasked with suppressing the revolt in Judea, Vespasian required veterans familiar with desert terrain siege operations and eastern tribal tactics. He looked first to Syria, the nearest source of organized Roman might. Yet when orders came to dispatch vexallations from legions IV Scythica, III Gallica, and others posted along the eastern edge, the response staggered beneath the weight of compromise. Officers warned of depleted morale and lingering illnesses. Quartermasters reported difficulties extracting arms and provisions from civilian contracted depots, and centurions, reluctant to strain already thin authority, struggled to rally men whose lives had ceased to orbit Roman directives alone. The soldier of Syria had not become a deserter, but his loyalty had grown layered. Rankers now owed almost as much to Antioch's markets as to the Principate. A shieldless legionary was rare, but behind the shield stood a man who might sleep alongside Greek theater masks and offering to Baal, who sustained his off-duty hours with Anatolian cults or Dionysian troops camped just outside the castra. Recruitment itself had grown fluid in the East. Many legionaries were the sons of local families whose Romanization served economic more than ideological ends. These men bled under the Aquila, yes, but they danced after hours in Seleucid rhythms. Vespasian's campaign ultimately succeeded, but it required forceful consolidation. He brought in reinforcements from outside Syria, commissioned local tribal auxiliaries, and leaned heavily on marine detachments from coastal bases under his control as former governor of Syria. The shift signaled a long-term change. Roman reliance on vexallations, detached units, became increasingly necessary not just for logistics but for discipline. Commanders could no longer trust entire legions garrisoned too long in the East to behave as uniform instruments of imperial intention. They had become instruments of the East themselves, resonating with its rhythms, fattened by its pacifism. Behind the immediate problem loomed a deeper tension. The castra had ceased to be just a bulwark, it had become a theater of cultural dilution. The rituals of the Principate, oaths, games, even punishments, had to compete with local deities. Unofficial Saturnalia, repeated out-of-season and leisure routines that bore no resemblance to Rome's martial ideal. For a senator far off in Rome, this was degeneration, but for a camp prefect living amid both Parthian gold and Greek lyric, it was adaptation. By the end of the 1st century, as Flavian emperors struggled to reassert fiscal and military central control, Syria posed less a threat from without than a warning from within. The Eastern Front was not faltering under Parthian assault, it was fading into the landscape. Rome's enemies remained over the horizon, but her legions now had roots, and roots do not march. Farther east on the edge of the desert, old rivalries with the Parthian sphere murmured back to life. Their even garrison shadows cast longer consequences. By the 3rd century, in the battered dusk of imperial order, the Roman death roll looked increasingly strange. Legionary names were still scratched into wooden tablets and copied in the camps officium, but the lines beneath no longer told only of enemy javelins, frostbite, or disease. Instead, more and more frequently, they recorded deaths by accident, duel, gambling dispute, or drunken fall. What battle did not finish, fate and folly completed? And officers who once tallied fallen by cohort against barbarian kills found themselves falsifying reports to conceal deaths that came not in glory but in shame. Far from Rome detached from civic supervision and pulled into long stagnant garrisons, the army had shifted. After battles, especially those deep in frontier territory where resupply took weeks, even months, discipline frayed. Camp leisure, always a hazardous indulgence, turned habitual. In places like the Upper Rhineland and Dacia's Sarmizegetusa legionaries received pay irregularly, but still had time, fear, and wine in ready supply. The auxilia sometimes brought local brews, spiced mead barley drinks, or fermented goat milk with an edge of narcotic poppy. Drunk, bored, half-paganized, these soldiers drifted from formation drills into night games that had little resemblance to official pastimes. What began as a clatter of dice on a shield became something darker. Few legionaries could resist the allure of improvised gambling bones coins, even rations wagered on tabula or fast-tossed tesserae. But when the stakes rose too high or losses mounted, fists followed. Sicci, curved knives slowly outlawed but often carried in secret, found their way into hands during arguments turned sudden duels. The line between play and murder blurred. Senior officers, especially centurions, and the tribuni militum often buried such incidents where they could, sometimes literally. Reports were redacted, casualties attributed to patrol, misfortune, even enemy snipers, who existed only on paper. The imperial bureaucracy tolerated this fiction so long as unit strength seemed intact. Manpower, after all, had become hard to replenish, with plagues in the city's shrinking tax rolls and a growing reliance on barbarian recruits. Losses by leisure could not be officially acknowledged without provoking questions the system could not afford. The military censura had frayed, administrative precision gave way to functional silence. Even the structure of death itself had mutated. Once Roman soldiers died in formal ways, with pyres with honor, with obsequies governed by ius militiae. Now their ends might come in a cramped tent in a fight over a stolen amphora, or at night in the arms of a prostitute from beyond the Danube. In some garrisons, local custom met Roman ritual in unsettling fusions. In Palmyra and along the Syrian front, Mithraic initiates buried their slain brothers under signs and ceremonies that never passed through the Sacra Publica. The army's old civic soul, bound to the mos maiorum and rituals regulated from the Ara Maxima to the temples of Capitoline Jupiter, found its grip slipping. Commanders facing facts adapted strategy. In military zones like Pannonia Inferior or the African limes, deaths without honor still had to be managed with solemnity. Retired veterans bore tales of men who had never met Parthian steel but still earned cremation and honors because it was politically useful to portray a full century's worth of loyalty and cohesion. The truth, off-duty accidents, ritual misfires, game-fueled homicides, was irrecoverable beneath the weight of military pageantry. Purple-draped standards and horned salutes closed ranks not only for the dead but for the story that followed. And so the funerals went on. Sometimes they masked foul play. A vendetta waged between rival maniples during a siege could end in a fatal clash explained away as a scouting disaster. In winter Castra, men frozen to death in drunken stupors were said to have been caught in a patrol blizzard. Such euphemisms became too polished to discredit. The chroniclers of campaign seasons, clerks, scribes, prefects, ceased to distinguish between what happened and what ought to have happened. The consequences, though hidden, spread. Civilians living on the edge of these garrisons found themselves in guarded fear. Towns like Vindobona or Lugdunum, once hubs of Roman civic life, began to resemble besieged outposts where armed men wandered outside constabulary control. Tavern brawls in provincial forums no longer ended in arrests, but in blood-stained alleys hastily cleared before morning watch. The legions had become a force, inward-looking, less imperial sword than self-consuming coil. One unspoken reality hardened beneath all of this: the enemy was still out there. Across the Danube, the Gothic waves coalesced, testing Roman defenses by small raids and shifting alliances. In Mesopotamia, Sasanian armies trained with state-supplied cavalry and reserves of fire-intensive siege techniques. A Roman force weakened by internal decay, even if numerically strong, risked devastating collapses when confrontation came. And confrontation was coming. As pressure approached from all directions, Germanic uprisings in Rhaetia, restive tribes in Mauritania, and logistical collapse from decaying roads and overburdened Annona routes. The question was not whether Rome could still field armies. It was whether those armies still believed in the fight at all. In the intervals between steel and silence, after the shouting died across the field and bodies cooled in the dirt, the Roman legionary reverted from warrior to man, bone-tired, underfed, and often barely sober. Across the empire's many frontiers, from the sodden Danube to the drying coasts of Africa proconsularis, the rhythms of war gave way to smaller rituals. A loaf shared dice clacking softly across a shield, the muted mutter of curses and boasts. Rations, principally wheat from the Annona, were allotted, sparingly transported with difficulty along compromised roads or through unreliable port systems. When wagons lagged behind or grain fleets from Africa were delayed, hunger pressed close. The pools scraped from bronze pots grew thin, stretched with wild herbs, or bolstered with whatever could be purchased outside the palisade. Gambling became more than simple leisure. It was a gesture of control amidst the unrelenting uncertainty of campaign life. At the edge of the world, winter camps stiffened under frost. In Germania, during operations under Nero Claudius Drusus, men sheltered in contubernia, not merely from the cold but from boredom, the latent enemy that decayed discipline faster than frost-rotted sandals. In these shelters, dice struck wood or shield boss knucklebones carved with scratches and soot. The game of tabula, cousin to today's backgammon, demanded boards, pebbles, time, and coin. Wagers consumed not just silver but shreds of authority. When curators failed to enforce limits and legates neglected cohesion, the boundary between harmless game and incipient mutiny eroded. A man who lost too much might steal. One who won too often might vanish before next muster, dragging morale with him. Wine, ideally rationed, was a different threat. The optio second to the centurion was expected to regulate access. Diluted wine doled in careful modi was permitted even in active operation zones. Yet in the chill of Rhaetian autumn or the overgrowth beyond the Tigris, rules melted in camaraderie or were traded away at sword point. Pilfered amphorae filled valleys with song and vomiting. Traders from surrounding tribes, Dacians, Gauls, Syrians, saw the opening and brought stronger spirits, meads, fermented mares, milked the smoke-laced liquors of the East. Behind the walls of castra, drunkenness led not always to laughter, sometimes to manslaughter, a comrade killed by fist or fall wrapped in a torn cloak, buried before report, his fate blurred in a censored tabulation. Where the tents abutted, open ground trade developed beyond official scrutiny. The area beyond the Porta di Cumana, nominally a transit zone for messengers and merchants, grew wild with cooks, jesters, and prostitutes. Impromptu markets sprouted. Smoked meats, oil cakes, dice makers, hawking devil's tools, veteran jugglers mimicking the gestures of the emperor's speech. Roman law discouraged such intrusion, but few commanders sent steel into the stalls. The lupinaria and the cometus wagons kept men occupied and away from worse social unrest. But among the sellers came the profiters, wandering frauds who plied rigged games, counterfeit coin, or bodies not willingly sold. Imperial discipline failed fastest at the edges, not from attack, but from unchecked indulgence championed by absent command. Even structured festivals could lose command of their shape. Saturnalia, Rome's winter inversion of status and privilege, was carried with the legions to the most remote provinces. Outside Mogontiacum, near the twisting Rhine, a Saturnalia feast intended to foster unity among auxilia and legions collapsed into brawl. Batavian scouts drunk mocked Latinate rites. Legionaries, half-masked in festival garb, struck back with iron instead of jest. At least 3 died. The tribunus convened a hasty court, reimposed curfews, paddled the suspected ringleaders. But for days, no patrol crossed the frozen river. Tribal loyalty now in question, Roman discipline in retreat. Then came the year of chaos, 69 CE. In northern Italia at Ticinum, an entire garrison swelled into revolt. Galba, tight-fisted, had withheld donatives and ignored troop demands. Wine, dice, and unattended grievances fermented in the barracks. Without orders, the soldiers detained their officers and declared for Vitellius, who offered gold where his predecessor had sent silence. The pastimes born of boredom became weapons. Vitellius, eager to outmatch his rivals, pardoned the mutiny and let it stand, a precedent that made entertainment no longer just a release, but a vector for political power. As garrisons dulled under peace, an age something stranger took root. In shadowed passageways and abandoned storehouses, soldiers turned toward Eastern cults not officially sanctioned by the Senate. Mithraic rites, with their secret sacrifice and initiatory tests, provided structure when Rome's civic rites felt distant. Altars to Isis rose in Pannonia. In the east, local gods merged with Roman ones. Gods of springs, of hills of thunder, walked now in Roman sandals. Cohesion shifted, not upward to Rome, but sideways into oaths of smoked blood and shared secrets beneath the camp chapel. Syria offered a final lesson. In Antioch and Emesa, legions garrisoned too long softened. They relished theater, sampled Parthian perfumes, took local women not just for a night, but as de facto wives. Supplies were steady threats minor. But when Vespasian called men west to Judea's rebellion, these same legionaries buckled. Morale frayed on the march, desertion spiked, and transfer-prone units resisted orders. Their comfort had not bred loyalty, their roots in city life had outgrown their duty to imperium. Entertainment, once a safety valve, became its own form of ascent and decay. By the reigns of Elagabalus and Gallienus, command ranks were home to former jesters, dancers, and mimes, elevated by court influence rather than campaign distinction. Military displays warped into theater, parades staged more often than patrols, armor polished for optics not function. The army's spirit thinned. Men still drilled, but their eye drifted not to the horizon but to the dais. Rome's sword, once tempered in battle, flexed now in pageant. Yet even as sound and spectacle filled the camp, a silence gathered in the provinces, a premonition. Discipline might return, but not without cost. Some frontiers, like frostbitten Moesia or rebellious Mauritania, would bleed before they bowed. The army could play, but Rome herself could still fall. After the clash of iron and the retreat of enemies, the Roman legionary returned not to glory, but to a modest fire, a ladle of boiled grain, and if the supply wagons kept time, a crumb of dried fruit or vinegar wine. The Annona Rome supply system was meant to stretch from the fertile plains of Africa to icy outposts beyond the Rhine. But when whether rebellion or corruption delayed, the road rations shrank. What the soldier could not earn in battle, he often sought in dice. Around campfires, on flattened shields or bare ground, ivory knucklebones clattered. Gambling blurred the line between idleness and survival panties, and coin changed hands faster on luck than on order. In lean months, the difference between hunger and a warm meal could rest on a single toss. During the long pauses of winter campaigns, such as Drusus's push into Germania, games like tabula and tesserae flooded the tents. These distractions, unofficial but tolerated, offered momentary control in landscapes ruled by snow's silence and hostile watchfires beyond the river. The games began as rest but could slide into ruin. As curators increasingly distanced themselves from garrisons on the frontiers and centurions grew lax after years abroad, gambling often spun into fights, theft, even death. Spoils of war, rather than enriching the state or funding repairs, were bartered away over bets, leaving equipment battered and soldiers bitter. A barbarian ambush, when it came, sometimes simply interrupted the final hand. Wine, rationed, diluted, and begrudgingly distributed by the optio, was the constant companion to idle time. It strengthened bonds, soothed wounds, and offered lightness after marching under leaden skies. Yet regulation disintegrated in snowbound outposts. Local merchants, especially in frontier settlements from Rhaetia to Cappadocia, grew wealthy peddling stronger brews, uncut wine, barley, beer, exotic syrups. The cost was drunken disorder. Brawls broke out over spilt wine, missing coin, insults lost in translation. Patrols returned late. Punishments slipped. A single amphora could undo a month of discipline. At the edge of the castra, where the laws of the commander faded, informal markets bloomed. Lupenaria entertainers, food sellers, and those without license or uniform who traded pleasure for denarii or knives. Prostitutes mingled freely with soldiers. Singers and dancers moved between tents. Speculators followed armies not to fight, but to feed off them, using trust and charm to gain entry. Profiteers promised goods they could not provide. Brothels sprouted overnight, often inside makeshift shelters. Commanders reluctant to spark unrest over moral grievances rarely intervened, unless violence spilled inward. In these moments, the army became a polity of its own, its customs shaped by appetite, not Rome. Each December, Saturnalia stirred this brew into near chaos. In theory, it was the festival of inversion, a time when masters served slaves, gambling was permitted, and restraints lifted. In northern castra, such as those near Mogontiacum, with auxiliaries from distant provinces, the inversion turned to eruption. Legionaries, emboldened by the pretext of tradition, drank to stupor and mocked their officers. Once, when Batavian scouts and Roman troops clashed in a drunken dispute over festival games, the Merle killed 7. The tribunus had to negotiate reparations to the Batavian prince under threat of mutiny. Saturnalia, once light-hearted, had become a pressure valve, releasing only blood. In 69 CE, as Galba's austerity stifled a bloated army and food was late to Ticinum, lines between gambling, drinking, and sedition collapsed. Promised donatives never arrived. Troops, led not by firebrands but by shared grievance, refused watch duty. The mutiny shimmered with the excitement of theater. Dice games turned political. Vitellius seized the moment. He promised coin and liberty from petty discipline, and in return received loyalty forged in campfire vice. Ticinum proved that entertainment, once a relief, could become governance. As the centuries passed and the frontiers stretched thin, Roman civic rights lost their hold. In their place emerged mystery cults, Mithras in underground shrines, Isis in candlelit corners, Syrian and Asiatic deities adopted by units longing for meaning beyond Rome's official theology. Initiation replaced census. Brotherhoods replaced the Senate. Such cults offered structure, but notably non-civic ones, disrupting the old fabric of shared ritual. Rarely did commanders resist, as morale turned more on belief than banners. Nowhere was this shift more apparent than in Syria. Garrisoned too long in soft climates like Antioch, legions absorbed Eastern tastes, seduced by local drama troupes, perfumed dinners, and unregulated lupenaria. When Vespasian prepared to crush Judean resistance, he found the Syrian legions plump docked in Greek theaters and more loyal to merchants than to Rome. They could still march, but no longer swiftly nor by simple command. By the 3rd century, not even enemies killed most soldiers. Reports tell of deaths from alehouse knives, failed bets, collapsing brothels. The funerals were quiet, the causes often brushed over in tabularia reports. Senior officers, eager to preserve the illusion of control, attributed collapse not to camp violence but ambiguous illness or accident. Yet the figures grew. Sword wounds with no battle, drownings near latrines. Rome's legions, once models of steel and law, had turned on themselves. In the shadow of emperors like Elagabalus and Gallienus, soldiers cheered mimes elevated to senatorial dignity. Parades replaced patrols as military festivals blurred into cabaret. True combat training fell to the sidelines when promotions came through flattery, not valor. On distant frontiers, some soldiers marched in armor lined with silk, their lances polished for show, not siege. Campaigns began late and ended early. By 363 CE, when Julian advanced toward Ctesiphon with high hopes and old manners, the camp songs were gone. Gone too were the laughter of dice, the raw humor carved into tin, posts the shouts of Saturnalia jesters. In their place, hymns, prayers, and moral restraint. Julian, child of pagan memory, tried to revive Apollo among commanders baptized in Christ. But faith, like entertainment, did not shield bodies from Persian arrows. At Ctesiphon, morale counted for nothing when navigation failed, when supplies ran low, when fire arrows struck grain ships. The laughter never returned. There were still fires, still tents, but no games. No dice rolled. The silence held. East of the Euphrates, fresh recruits now marched wearing symbols they did not understand. They passed theaters filled only with dust. The rhythm of an old army echoed in the walls, but no legionary sang. Not yet. By the 5th century, the sinews of empire had slackened. Across the provinces of Gaul and Hispania, the standard of the Roman legion had become a memory, yet fragments of its life lingered in the habits of men who once bore arms for emperors. These veterans, many displaced their pensions unpaid, their armor rusting, now stood at the edges of makeshift courts, guarding the whims of local warlords who called themselves Rex but wore Roman-style fibulae. In smoky halls under poorly thatched roofs, they drank from foreign cups, played at dice on splintered shields, and sang snatches of ribald soldier songs in rough Latin. The words misremembered, the rhythm intact. The forms remained, but the meaning, anchored once in disciplina virtus and the might of the Imperium Romanum, had slipped away. In these outer zones, formerly Gallia Lugdunensis, Baetica Tarraconensis, the rhythms of Roman military life echoed faintly. The castra were gone, but the routines survived as ritual. Veterans gambled with what trinkets they could scavenge, sleeves rolled to show faded unit tattoos, relics of detachments long broken. They poured watered wine with the care of men who remembered the rations of a Roman optio, though no copies of the Annona circulated anymore. The camp songs told of campaigns on the Rhine or Danube, names now as remote as myth. Boys born under barbarian kings learned Latin profanity from these men before learning to ride. They learned to call the dice tesserae, to shout venit sextus when fortune struck, but commerce no longer flowed. With roads fractured by raid or neglect, with tolls now levied by armed bands rather than publicani, the grain ships from Africa had stopped, and the markets of Narbo and Carthago, Nova carried local yield only. Amphorae were reused, often marked with the seals of vanished legions. Veterans sought strong drink through furtive barter, rough distillations from hill tribes, not the measured vina marum of Mediterranean stock. With little silver in circulation, games were played for knives, boots, even promises of food. The stakes were real, losers sometimes vanished into winter. The audience for their amusements had changed. Once veterans performed for their fellow legionaries or the occasional provincial dignitary posted to keep peace. Now they entertained foreign chieftains, men who wore Roman belts over fur, and who saw the dice game tabula as foreign spectacle rather than shared tradition. Prostitutes still circulated among the camps, though no longer regulated by camp prefects or licenses, and entertainers wandered from hillfort to villa, adapting Roman farce into local dialects, combining Saturn and Woden in crude comic roles. But all of it seemed out of place, as if dragged forward from another age. The line between performance and parody frayed. In darker corners, the rituals turned grim. When a feast coincided with former Roman holidays, Saturnalia Perilia, old soldiers would drunkenly enact the inversion of order that once served as winter respite. Residents of towns like Augusta Emerita or Lugdunum, now half derelict, half reclaimed, could still recall when such festivals meant state largesse, gambling license, and a brief upturn in cheer. But without Rome to anchor the calendar, such dates became dangerous. A Saturnalia staged by a band of disgruntled veterans near Tolosa turned bloody when mercenaries from the Subai mocked the rites. The memory of soldierly festivity had become a trigger for resentment, not unity. Cult practices endured though their forms had shifted. Mithraic shrines once huddled within walls of Roman castra, smoking with torchlight and secrecy. Now fragments of that mystery tradition flickered in the backrooms of hilltop churches, absorbed piecemeal into local Christianity, or hybridized with native rites. The veterans still gathered in semblance of a convivium, offering libations not to Caesar, but to ancestral gods whose names had no place in episcopal registers. Their fellow congregants, often sons or grandsons speaking Latin with Germanic inflections, held onto a notion of Rome not from law or tax collection, but from these fading inherited customs. What remained strongest was the sound of Roman Latin, roughened by exile, still dominant in the songs and chants passed between ex-soldiers like family silver. Even in the courts of Visigothic kings, such as Theodoric I or Euric, Roman war cries could be heard during drunken toasts or grudging parades. These kings employed Latin scribes, read Roman law codes, and structured their councils on the remembered concilium of Roman officers. Yet their soldiers tilted their heads when veterans spoke of Teutoburg, of Judea, of the bridges of Trajan, things said as if they mattered still when they did not. The Roman ideal of disciplina once enforced with flour rations, and the lash was now passed like fading rumor. No emperor came to inspect the ranks. No legatus Augusti arrived to mete out justice. The veterans stood at the threshold between two worlds, one shattered, the other uncertain. In the firelight of reclaimed villas and ruin-encircled mansions, old soldiers recited lines from Virgil or coarse military verse, teaching children how to kneel to Mars even as they themselves now knelt to local kings in barbarian courts. And still they gambled, still they sang, but the dice no longer clattered beneath the banners of Rome. They fell on cracked stone, and along dusty courtyards far from any road an imperial surveyor would chart. The rituals persisted out of memory, not purpose, and like all empty forms they risked filling with new alien meaning. West of the Rhone, south of Braga, in villages no longer marked on imperial maps, the last embers of Roman military culture flickered, not with pride but with inertia. The legions were gone. The empire had not replaced them, and the tribes, those once named barbarii in dispatches to the Senate, were watching, learning, and waiting. In 16 BCE, as Drusus, the elder advanced deep into Germania, Magna Rains turned roads to sludge, and the Annona faltered under the weight of stretched supply lines. Hungry and soaked legionaries of Legio V. Alaudi dug in behind timber palisades far from Italia, surrounded by churning forests and unseen foes. With 0.8 kg grain per soldier per day, morale hung on the edge of discipline. At dusk, smoke curled from the castra, mingling with shouts from dice games, slurred songs over watered wine, and the slap of tabula pieces on wooden boards. Off-duty hours became a form of survival, but not all distractions stayed harmless. After battle, the legionary did not return to glory, but to grain. At the edge of empire, whether on the Rhine's wet frontier or among the windswept ridges of the Danube, a soldier's reward came not in silver or parade, but in a weekly allocation, fist-sized measures of wheat, sometimes barley, doled out from canvas sacks by quartermasters already fretting over dwindling stores. From this grain, he baked coarse panis militaris in field ovens, or stirred up the simple gruel pools in battered bronze pots over makeshift fires. It sustained life, but only barely. When the Annona failed to arrive, when mules foundered in alpine passes or local prefects mismanaged shipments, those fires grew quieter. Hunger crept in thin as smoke and made leisure less choice than escape. Around those fading flames, wood smoke curled with human want. Dice, tesserae made from bone, struck the backs of shields in rhythmic pulses. Coins changed hands, or when coins ran thin, so did trinket spoils tucked away after skirmishes, a brooch from a Helvetii, corpse the edge of an Iberian blade too worn to reforge. Small wooden boards traced with lines hosted games like tabula, a tactical contest of chance and cunning that mimicked war with its shifting positions and agonizing odds. Gambling here was not mere pastime. In the muddy perimeter camps during Drusus's northern expeditions, where Germania's forests closed like fists around the marching columns, dice were a form of prayer and sometimes a surrender. Men wagered more than they could afford: food, weapons, even their own boots or a promised share of a future plunder. When the curators tried to restrain the damage, enforcing temporary bans or inflicting latrine duty on the worst offenders, resentment deepened. What began as disorder among dice could, and sometimes did, erupt faster than a German ambush in the trees. Wine too played its part. Roman discipline demanded dilution. Venom was supposed to be mixed with water poured in strict measure, often meted out by the optio at dusk. But those rules set down in the theorized legion dissolved readily under cold skies and bitter loneliness. Casks took on value higher than gold. Aged Kekuben or even sour black Falernian brought by quartermasters might vanish from official stores and appear miraculously in the tents of centurions, or passed hand-to-hand through the contubernium. In rougher garrisons, traders from nearby settlements, Dacians, Numidians, Greeks, offered something stronger. In amphorae of unmarked make came fermented fruit liquors or eastern syrups laced with unknown substances. The joy it offered was immediate. The disorder it caused followed swiftly. Brawls rose without warning. Knives replaced fists. Some died with their throats slit beside the same fire where they had toasted an hour before. The legatus or his tribuni might investigate, but in many cases a burial and silence were faster. Discipline was the harder law to enforce than death. Beyond the palisade walls of the castra, unofficial markets sprawled in crude geometry: timber stalls, tin-lined cookfires, linen tents where women laughed too easily. These were the flesh of the Visai settlements that fed the armies and bled them in turn. Prostitutes drifted between tents and trade stalls. Comedians, some trained in Roman mime, others local storytellers with nothing but voice and gestures, drew crowds tight as an ambush. The army tolerated it at times, welcomed it. These diversions made peace more durable than punishment. But they also seeded chaos. Profiteers followed, speculators without scruple drawn to the camps like carrion birds to a battlefield. They sold illicit wine, pushed sham medicines, fixed games, and peddled foreign lust in shadowy corners of Lupinaria. Their presence often went unchallenged, unless a scandal cut to a commander's reputation. Theft, assault, disease, these were the smuggled costs of erotic entertainment. Still, the highest flame flickered during Saturnalia. In December, even under northern skies, the Roman inversion of order, the festival of chaos crowned in gifts, gambling, and permitted insolence, entered the camps with reckless vigor. Soldiers crowned each other with mock garlands. Centurions dined with privates. Rank vanished for a night, sometimes two. In provinces like Germania Superior, where auxiliaries from the Batavi or Tungri stood beside Latin-speaking regulars, the Saturnalian abandoned blurred distinctions too far. Near Mogontiacum, a Saturnalia feast among mixed cohorts turned violently tribal. A Batavian insulted in play struck back in truth. Blades followed. Corpses littered the snow. Only swift action by a local tribunus threatening discharge and exile restored the boundary between revelry and reason. But the tension lingered. Order enforced by fear leaves no laughter. Elsewhere in empire, festivity gave birth to mutiny. In 69 CE, the year of 4 emperors, a legion camped near Ticinum revolted. Their world had unraveled. Nero dead, without honor Galba stingy and severe. Wages were unpaid, the promise of donativa dissolved in the cold policies of senatorial restraint. In that vacuum, games turned into grievance. Wine replaced oaths, and dice cast in rage rather than jest snapped all restraint. Murder followed. Discipline collapsed. Yet from that collapse Vitellius emerged. He offered coin celebration and a reaffirmation of every indulgence Galba had denied. It worked, for a time. But loyalty bought by distraction is never permanent. Around every campfire across every provincial border, the mood of the soldier shifted with his supplies and his horizon. When the Annona moved well, when pay came on the Kalends, when game stayed within bounds, then the songs returned. Laughter echoed beneath wooden watchtowers. But when supply lines frayed, when commanders turned blind, and when frontline winters deepened, a single throw of dice could spark more than death. The flame became too bright, and shadows lengthened around it, waiting. In the wake of conquest, once the standards had been raised again, once the enemy bodies were buried, and once silence returned across the wet rims of pine forests or the desolate moors of Noricum, the legionary world did not grow quiet. On the edges of empire, beyond the shadow of the capital, and deep into lands still called hostile, Roman soldiers turned to dice, drink, and diversion to blunt the boredom that gnawed more persistently than any Gallic blade. Around the campfires of the northern lines, where Marcus Drusus advanced beyond the Rhine in 12 BCE, frigid evenings were punctuated not by battle orders, but by the rattle of dice against bronze shields and shouted boasts in guttural Latin. Objects unearthed from former castra, stag-antler dice scratch game board styluses for scoring, matched the written records passed on by chroniclers and military documents. Gambling was not the exception, but embedded in the rhythm of camp life. The ubiquitous game of tabula, an early variant of backgammon, involved careful movement of tokens across engraved boards governed by dice throws and loud curses. Other soldiers gambled with tali, the knuckle bones of animals whose asymmetry offered irregular odds and volatile outcomes. Wagers were placed with coins, trinkets, loot from raids, or even portions of the daily ration. When men wagered more than they owned, debts were converted into labor promises, or, in darker corners, violence. Roman law was not silent on such amusement. Within the Pomerium, the legal boundary of Rome itself, gambling for real stakes was largely banned under the Lex Illyria and the Lex Titia. But beyond Rome, on the frontiers, enforcement was inconsistent and dependent on the temperament of local curators and tribuni. The challenge was stark: how to impose senatorial order on men living among chaos and temptation, hunting morale, not philosophy. Some commanders issued private edicts limiting stakes or restricting games to designated hours. Others turned a blind eye, fearing that curbing such practices outright might ferment resentment amid months without plunder or pay. If the legion thrived on discipline, then gambling was its fracture point. Winnings inflated quickly in winter, when operations halted and boredom peaked, and winners became arrogant, losers bitter. Accusations of cheating, real or imagined, often dissolved into fistfights and bloodshed. In certain units posted near the lip or under tents before Rhaetian towns, tribunals had to convene not for enemy skirmishes, but for internal punishments relating to disputes that began with a throwing die and a glinting aureus. The sense of camaraderie forged in shared hardship could just as quickly fracture over a pawned cloak or a boast too far. Commanders faced a dilemma: suppressing wagers entirely risked revolt, but unchecked they bred subordination. One compromise was to allow controlled gambling, games sanctioned by centurions in sight of options, possibly even with set house rules. Anecdotes hint at elite officers joining such rounds themselves, easing tensions with their men through calculated appearances of fraternity. Yet the illusion of control rarely lasted. When the Annona faltered, whether from storm-blocked roads, overextended supply lines, or defeat, it was not rare to see soldiers illegally bartering loot for food, then gambling that food away, then taking from the unwatched satchel of a comrade to recover losses. Among auxiliaries, Batavi horsemen, Syrian archers, Thracian infantry, gambling rituals varied, but the effect was the same: a tide of restless energy rolling through barracks, disrupting the fragile strata of duty and identity the Roman army cultivated. And when native scouts levied under treaty or privilege, shared tents, With legionary veterans too long unpaid, a single gaming dispute could unleash fatal consequences. More than one mutiny began not from strategy or inspiration, but from the murder of a gaming partner.